Ever wondered which leather glue is right for your project? Today we're breaking down the 4 main types, their strengths, and when to use them. My name is Corbin, and this is the 3rd episode of our Fundamental Skills for Beginner Leather Crafters. And if you need to get caught up on those first couple of episodes, we have those linked in the description below. But for now, let's take a look at the 4 main types of leather adhesives so you can determine which ones are best for your projects. Today we're going to take a close look at water-based white glues, contact cements, spray adhesives, and lastly, basting tape. These adhesives are all very different and used for different types of applications. And we actually just filmed a fun video where we put all these adhesives to the test and see how they stacked up against one another. You can watch that video here if you want to check that out. And based on our findings, here's how I'd characterize these glues. Let's start off with water-based white glues. The one that we carry is the Fiebings Leathercraft Cement. This glue has medium strength, requires no set time, allows you to shift the pieces after you put them together, and dries clear. And one tip that I like to use when working with this type of glue is to use a rougher to just rough off the surfaces that you're about to join together, and it exposes those fibers and gives the glue something to grab onto. Roughing up the surface will just give you the best bond possible when working with these types of glues. Next, we'll move on to our contact cement. We carry the S18. It has a high strength, but does require 10 to 15 minutes of set time, meaning you have to let it dry before you put the 2 pieces together. And when you do put them together, they tack immediately and you can't really shift them afterwards. And a couple tips and things to know when working with this glue is that it stinks. It's got a pretty strong odor, so make sure you're in a well-ventilated area or have some respiratory protection. And also, like I said, once you place those pieces together, they pretty much tack immediately, so you get one shot at getting the perfect placement. Next, we'll talk about our spray adhesive. This right here is the CushionRite. It has a medium to low strength, a quick set time of less than 5 minutes. It also tacks immediately, but you can reposition these if you have to. And spray adhesives like the CushionRite are great when you got to put 2 large panels together, whether that's leather to leather or leather to some sort of fabric. One tip is just to be mindful that if you have overspray and you shift those pieces and it gets on the front of your piece, it's going to be difficult to remove. Lastly, we'll talk about basting tape, which has low strength, no set time because it's a tape. It tacks immediately, but you can also reposition this one if you need to. A couple of tips when working with basting tape. If you're trying to put 2 pieces together and have an invisible seam, it is going to leave a gap, so I'd recommend using S18 for that sort of application. Another thing to know about basting tape is it does have the tendency to gunk up your needle, whether you're machine or hand sewing. Here's a couple more rules of thumb. White glues and basting tapes are all non-permanent bonds, so really just use those products when you're planning on sewing your pieces afterwards. But contact cement is the strongest, most permanent bond, so if you don't plan on sewing your pieces, this kind of glue is going to be your best bet to get the best bond possible. And if you really need some strength, 2 coats of the contact cement is by far the strongest. Our test showed that it's 66% stronger than when you just use 1 coat. And since leather is so porous, the first coat absorbs down and adheres to the fibers. Then the second coat adheres to that first coat and then recoats the surface. So everything is sitting on our silicone glue mat, which just allows for a really easy cleanup because the glue just comes right off of it. Right here is the rougher tool, and like I mentioned earlier, this just roughs up the surface of the leather and exposes those fibers so that the glue can adhere to them. And the scratch awl is an alternative for the rougher tool. It's just not quite as efficient since it's not built for that purpose. Right here is the glue container and brush set. This is for water-based glues. It's just a really easy way to store your glue, and it's got a convenient brush and spatula on either side of the wand right there. Right here is the glue spreader, which also has a silicone tip for easy cleanup. I like to use this with the S18, especially if I'm working along an edge, just to have more control than the brush that's included with that bottle. And down here we've got the leather press roller and the leather hammer, and these are great just when you put those 2 surfaces together to either tap them down or roll them down so the whole surface area touches one another. So now let's put these tools and glues to work and get started with our tote bag and wallet projects. So let's go over how I approach the glue up for the wallet project. And I had to go ahead and burnish and finish the edges of these pockets because it'll be impossible to get to them later after the glue up. We'll cover this in more detail in a future episode. I decided to use the S18 glue because it gives us a nice invisible seam, better than what the basting tape or Fiebings would have done. So I roughed up the inside of the main panel and did the same for the inside pocket. Then I applied my S18 glue and I made sure to apply it evenly around all the edges. Waited until that got tacky, and then put the 2 pieces together. And then I used my leather hammer to tap everything together, just making sure everything is sitting flush. Then I just repeated that process for the other pocket. Then the next layer of the piece is the pocket, which goes on top of the inside pocket, so I repeated the same process. Marked where the piece needs to go with my pin, roughed up that section, applied the glue, and I made sure to apply it evenly around all the edges. Let that get tacky, then I put that piece down. Then I repeated this for the other pocket. Then I flipped it over to the back, same process again, same glue, so you should know the drill by now. Roughed it all up, put the glue down, let that get tacky, and then I applied the first half of the piece, making sure I leave an opening in the middle, which allows it to fold over on itself, and when it's flat, it pops it open so you have some volume there to put contents inside that pocket, whether it be cash or cards, and then I did the same for the other side. And after I glued that final section, we're done with the glue up and we're ready to move on to the next step, which we'll cover in the next video, which is sewing it. So for the tote bag, I started off by applying neat's foot oil and leather balm to all the leather, just because the natural veg tan is just really light. So I wanted to darken it up a tone or two and get some more depth of color out of it and have a little bit more of a unique look. And so after I'd done the neat's foot oil and the leather balm, I started to do the glue up. I used the basting tape, the Fiebings leathercraft cement, and the S18 contact cement. The first thing I glued was actually the straps, because these are 2 pieces together. And so I had 4 pieces, roughed it all up. I used the Fiebings leathercraft cement because it doesn't get instantly tacky. So once I put the pieces down, if I was off by just a millimeter or so, I had the flexibility to move that over and get it perfectly aligned. And so that's why I used that product for the straps. And then the next thing I did was I was working on this front pocket here, and I started off by marking a line and folding it over 1/2 inch. And the way that I got that to stay folded over was I used the S18. Since it gets so tacky, once I fold it over, it stays put rather than springs right back up because of the tension of the leather. So it was a perfect use case for the S18 right there. I was then able to use the hole punch to punch the hole where the decorative and reinforcement rivets are going to go between the pocket and the body of the bag. And I went ahead and sewed that top flap down that we had folded over, just because it'll be impossible to sew that later once it's attached to the body of the bag. Then I used my leather wing divider to mark a guideline for me to stitch over. And then to get that onto the body of the bag, I used the basting tape just because it really just needed to be on there for a few seconds. Doesn't need a strong hold because I was going to sew it immediately after. And another reason why I use basting tape as opposed to glue, first of all, because it was easy, but also this isn't a seam here that I need to put together and burnish and make invisible. It's a panel on top of another panel. So it was a great reason to use the basting tape. And I love that the basting tape gives you some flexibility. I didn't want the backing of all 3 sides to be removed because I wanted to be able to place one corner, take the backing off of 2 of the 3 sides, and then get that corner down. And then finally, once I'd made sure the placement was correct, I could remove the 3rd piece and then complete the positioning of the pocket. It's nice to not have to do it all at once, so you can place one corner down perfectly, stick the other corner, and then go back and finish with that final corner. And after I had the pocket placed in the correct position using the basting tape, I was then able to use the hole punch to punch the hole where the decorative and reinforcement rivets are going to go between the pocket and the body of the bag. So after I put that pocket in the correct position, I had to go ahead and sew that because the next part of the process is going to involve putting the bag inside out and then sewing those side seams. And while I had the main panel laying flat, I cut 1/4 inch squares out of this part of the bag. And this part is called the gusset, and it is what gives the bag volume. So once we get this all sewn together, that's what gives the bag its shape. And the reason I'm cutting this out is just to remove a little extra material to make sewing the gusset a little bit easier. And now that that's done, I can go ahead and install the rivets. After that, I moved on to the side seams. I roughed around all the edges and used the Fiebings glue again here. I just ran a bead along that line and then used the glue spreader to even that out. Then I repeated this on the other side. Then I stuck the 2 pieces together, shifted it around to make sure everything lined up perfectly, and clipped the edges together. And once that was glued and before I started sewing, I punched a hole in the corners, which is where a reinforcement rivet is going to go, just because that's an area of the bag that might have high stress and I don't want that seam to ever break. And then I took it over to the sewing machine to sew those seams. I also went ahead and punched the holes where the straps are going to go. You can do this earlier, but I decided to do it at this point in the process so that I could punch the front and the back at the same time. And then the last thing I had to glue for this project is the most difficult part. That's the gusset. So I used the big heavy hitter with the S18 to make sure everything stays where I want it to. So I had already roughed up those edges and I just got in there and applied the glue with my glue spreader. let that set for 5 or 10 minutes, and then I put the pieces together, making sure everything was well lined up. And after that, the next step was just to sew that gusset closed. And after I sewed the gusset closed, the next step is to turn the bag right side out, which is a bit of a process, but trust me, it's worth it in the end, because after you struggle through pulling and tugging at the leather, getting it right side out, eventually you've got a beautiful bag, and we've got only a couple steps left until we finished our project. So if you're wondering why you saw me sewing in our gluing video, that's just because sewing and gluing go hand in hand, and it just so happened to be the required order of operations for this project. But don't worry, we'll go more in depth in the sewing in our next video. So now you know the pros and the cons of these different adhesives, and you can be confident that you're selecting the best product for your next project. And if you happen to be running low on glue, we got you covered for everything you need here at Sailrite. The products I use today will be linked in the description below. And as always, if you feel like you learned something today, let us know by hitting that like and subscribe button. And if you have any questions about any of these glues or products I use, leave those comments down below. I do try to answer each and every one of those, but that's all we've got for you today. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.